students. Today we shall make a discussion on Sir Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry. About Philip Sidney the poet, you have some idea definitely, and I think in connection with your reading his poems, you also have some idea about his brief life, which was rather colorful. But this Sir Philip Sidney can be called the first in the field of literary criticism in England, in English language. Literary criticism definitely was not new, and you all know great names of Plato and Aristotle, Horace and Longinus. But English criticism or criticism in English language was first initiated by Sir Philip Sidney. And this, An Apology for Poetry, is the book where he elaborately discusses why poetry is the greatest form of human creation and human activity. In this lecture, I shall be giving you a summary of the arguments of Sir Philip Sidney about the greatness of poetry, and in the second part I shall briefly discuss some points about Sir Philip Sidney, the literary critique. Now, let us begin with Sir Philip Sidney as a man answering the arguments of Gauchon. Now, this was the immediate reason why Sir Philip Sidney wrote his An Apology for Poetry. Gauchon's book, which adversely criticized English poetry and English drama, had to be answered. And Sir Philip Sidney took upon himself to answer befittingly and to prove without any shadow of doubt that Gauchon's arguments were perhaps lame arguments, because poetry is the greatest activity of the human mind. Now, Sir Philip Sidney, 1554 to 1595, a very brief life, but well, he was definitely what he did even in this short span of life is commendable. Well, we have to we have to acknowledge this, that his once again, there was a small mistake that I made. Once again, I just want to want you to note the period of Sir Philip Sidney's life. So, in brief, I'll just recount the years. So, 1554, he was born, and well, his schooling started in 1564, and in 1568 he enters the Christ Church College, Oxford, and 1571 he leaves Oxford without taking any degree, and then he is sent to Paris, and Sidney in 1574 was sent to Italy, Poland and Vienna, and 1575 Sidney returns to England. Sidney joins his father in Ireland 1576, and 1577 he is sent to diplomatic missions, and 1578 he writes an able defense of his father's Irish policy. 1579 Sidney studies the use of Latin methods. 1580 Sidney probably completes Arcadia and writes an apology for poetry. Sidney becomes a member of the Parliament in 1581, and 1582 Sidney escorts Anjou to the Netherlands. 1583 Sidney is knighted. 1584 Sidney begins translation of a number of foreign works. 1585 Sidney is appointed Joint Masters of Ordnance. 1586 Sidney is wounded at war, Zutphen, and dies over there. So, I just stand corrected because I said 1554 to 1595. It's wrong. 1554 to 1586. So, very brief life. 1554 to 1586, which means he lived for only 32 years. So, Sidney, why did he take up this work? Well, an apology for poetry, I told you that, as an answer to Stephen Gosson's book, School of Abuse. School of Abuse was published in 1579, and Apology was published the next year, 1580. So, a man, as I said, a very colorful career, who lived for only 32 years, from 1554 to 1586, and not 95. That was a mistake I made. 1554 to 1586, only 32 years. And in these 32 years, he made his mark as a politician, as a poet, and as a critic. Here in this lecture, we are concerned with this man, that is Sir Philip Sidney, as a critique. And as I said, that this, an apology for poetry, is an answer to Stephen Gosson's school of abuse, which was an attack on poets and players, actors. Now, this is not a very fat book, small book, an apology for poetry, very concentrated, and it contains the ideas of Sidney, the ideas which can prove the greatness of poetry. Now I shall tell you something, that Sir Philip Sidney of England can be discussed along with the great minds like Plato, Aristotle, and Horace. Now, why Plato? Because Plato, in his Republic, chapter 3 and chapter 10 in particular, stated that poetry should be abandoned and poets should be banished from the ideal state, the ideal republic. He had his reasons. Aristotle was Plato's disciple. Aristotle, in his Poetics, as if gave an answer to Plato, and there Aristotle proved the greatness of poetry. Plato wanted to abandon poetry on the ground that poetry is mimesis, and Aristotle tried to establish the greatness of poetry on the ground that poetry is mimesis. Plato's mimesis and Aristotle's mimesis are explained, interpreted in different ways. So, we can relate our Philip Sidney with both Plato and Aristotle. And while Horace, because in his An Apology for Poetry, Sidney echoes Horace. Horace said that art, poetry or art, is both for instruction and delight. So the point delight is a very important one. Literature or art definitely gives us delight, which is very important. And the same thing is repeated by Sir Philip Sidney here in his Apology, An Apology for Poetry. He also says that poetry is both for instruction, education, and also for delight. In fact, delight is one of the principal factors for which we should read poetry. Now, I shall be giving you, as I said, a brief summary of the points that Sidney has made in his An Apology for Poetry. Poets are pioneers of knowledge. Because, well, when nothing was there, even, well, colleges, schools, universities, centers of instruction, academies, when these things were unthought of, it was poets who could give knowledge and instruction to the people. Because what is poetry? Poetry is, in fact, the reflection of the mind of the poet. What the poet thinks, what the poet feels, what the poet discovers. So all these are presented in his poetry. So poetry was perhaps the first tool that gave the most ancient people their knowledge. And in this connection, Sidney speaks of Homer, Hesiod, Dante, Petrarch, and even Chaucer. So all these were great poets, and through their great creations, perhaps they were the first to give people their knowledge. Now Homer's great epics, the great epics, the ancient people of Greece, they learned so many things. And subsequently, the other great names, the other great poets, they also produced natural knowledge, knowledge of life, knowledge of human existence in their poetry. So, poets are pioneers of knowledge. And poetry is something which was respected even in the ancient times. Even among uncivilized people, poets were respected, because even the so-called uncivilized people could understand the value of poetry as the instrument of knowledge. And here Sidney mentions the races like Saxons and Danes and Normans, who were not that civilized. The Greeks were civilized, but they were not. But even such races like Saxons, Danes, and Normans, they had deep respect for poetry and poets, because they could also understand the value of poetry in life. And the Romans called poets vates, V-A-T-E-S, vates, which means prophets. So the poets were prophets because the poets could give the true meaning of life, and therefore no other people of no other vocation can ever be compared with poets. All arts are subservient to nature. Only poetry transcends nature. Now please note this point, very important. All other arts are subservient to nature, but poetry transcends nature. Well, why subservient? Why? A painter paints, with nature in front. Or a carpenter works with wood which is taken from nature. A physician works with the human body which is a product of nature. But poet alone can make the existing nature golden. The brazen world is transformed into something golden only by poetry, only by the imagination of the poet. The imagination of the poet can transcend poetry to a superior level. Next point, poet is the idealist, and he can create something which is higher than the human faculty. While all other artists or artisans, they exercise their human faculty, they make use of nature and create something new. But perhaps the poets alone can improve on nature. So what is brazen is transformed into golden. Poetry is imitation. Well, here we can understand that, Sir Philip Sidney is echoing Plato and Aristotle. Poetry is imitation. But this imitation, according to Sir Philip Sidney, here also, as I said, here also he echoes Horace, and he says this imitation teaches us as well as delights us. So poetry performs a double function. It teaches and it delights. There are, as Sidney says, there are three kinds of poetry. One, the religious poetry, the philosophical poetry, and true poetry. So true poetry and the true poets can give us both instruction and delight. The perfection of the soul is best promoted by poetry. Now, any art, any form of art can definitely try to ennoble us, elevate us, but the greatest perfection of the soul can be given only by poetry, and therefore the poets are the most important members of the society. Well, what is knowledge? We talk of knowledge. Now, by knowledge, Sir Philip Sidney means knowledge that lifts the mind from the confines of the body. So, our human existence means our body and our mind. The outward reflection of the human existence, or rather the outward appearance of the human being, is the body. We exist because we have our body, but we exist because we have our mind. And what poetry does? Poetry lifts the mind. It elevates the mind. The body perhaps cannot be changed, but the mind can be changed. Well, a tall man cannot be made shorter, or a short man cannot be made taller. But the mind definitely can be changed. The shape of the mind, the form of the mind, the spirit of the mind can be changed. And this can be best changed by the greatest poets and their greatest poetry. And so poetry can be our law. We have our other laws, the moral laws, the philosophical laws, but the true law which can perfect us is the law of poetry and the law of the poets. Therefore, the poets are the greatest teachers. The poets are our greatest teachers. Now, briefly, these are the points that Sir Philip Sidney makes in his an essay on an apology for poetry. An apology for poetry. Well, there Sir Philip Sidney makes these points. Briefly, I have narrated them. Now, well, certain things may be said about Sir Philip Sidney as a literary critic. Now, what does Sir Philip Sidney actually say here? Does he speak about the poets or does he speak about poetry? So that may be, well, does he suggest that the poet and the poetry are a unified existence? Does he mean that? Poetry teaches and poet teaches. So does he link poets with their creation? Does he mean that? Now, well, we may have our misgivings there, because, well, a poet creates, but apart from his period of creation, he is somebody else. So poetry can teach us, but does the poet? If we ask this question, then naturally another question will come. It's who creates them? The creation of poetry is done by the poets. So Sir Philip Sidney does not elaborately discuss this. Another thing, and which Philip Sidney very correctly points out, that the charges against poetry, which were made by Stephen Gosson and which are made by many other people, should be considered as charges against bad poetry. Because if poetry is sublime, if poetry is great, then perhaps, these charges leveled by Gosson and others will not remain valid. So the charges against poetry are really the charges against bad poetry and bad poets. We have to remember that there is another point that, Sidney makes, which can be controversial. He says no poet is a born poet. No poet is a made poet. You cannot make anyone a poet. Poets are not made, poets are born. Now, he never discusses this point clearly and elaborately what exactly he means by this statement that poets are born, poets are not made. Now, from a practical point of view, perhaps, this will raise certain questions in us. And in fact, we can refer to a poem by Sidney himself, where I don't know whether you have read that poem in your UG days, where he speaks of a poetic process. The poet searches for his materials, loving in truth. The poet searches for materials. He searches for his source once in the works of older poets, and then he looks at some other sources, and finally the muse comes and tells him that he should look to his mind. So, process of creation, that is something which is a form of art. So, what he means when he says that a poet is born, the poet can never be made, can be answered in various ways. That the potentials of the poet must be there from the beginning. The poetic intuition must be there from the beginning. These things cannot be imported from anywhere. And but unfortunately, he doesn't discuss this point elaborately in his apology for poetry. And poetry, this is I'm quoting from Sidney. Poetry is an art of imitation, which both teaches us and delights us. That is an important point that Sidney has made, and we have tried to harp on this point now and again. At another point, Sidney says, it is not rhyming or versing that maketh a poet. Once again, it is not rhyming or versing that maketh a poet. Now, rhyming and versing. So, what does he mean? That meter is not important in poetry. So, that is a point that also he didn't discuss. Aristotle in Poetics, if you read Poetics chapter 1, you will see that Aristotle says that meter is important. It is not the primary thing, it's not the whole thing, but meter is important. But rhyming, is not that important to make a poet. He says two other points that I shall mention. Number one, Sidney compares poets with philosophers, and he compares them with historians. Poetry, philosophy, history. Among the three, poetry is the greatest, because neither, this is the argument of Sidney, neither the philosopher nor the historian can perhaps create anything new. They can state facts, they can try to interpret, they can make conjectures, but they cannot create anything new, which the poets can. Now, this argument of Sir Philip Sidney reminds me of a very famous sloka which is known in Sanskrit, and the sloka says that the poet is a creator. This is the sloka: apare kabba sangsare kavireka prajapati. So Prajapati, according to Hindu mythology, Prajapati or Brahma is the creator, and in the world of poetry, the poet is a Prajapati, poet is a creator. So as if the poet can be compared to the supreme creator God. God creates and poets also create, which the philosopher cannot do, which the historian cannot do. They cannot create something new. This is said by Sir Philip Sidney. Now I shall sum up now briefly. And Sir Philip Sidney, a very small span of life of 32 years, 1554 to 1586, and even in this small or brief span of life, he proved himself to be an outstanding man, a poet, a politician, a soldier, and also a critique, the first English critique. Now, Sir Philip Sidney had nobody to look to for inspiration when he was taking up his pen as a critique, because in England, in English thought, there was no prior tradition of literary criticism, and we can say that considering this, the achievement of Sir Philip Sidney is stupendous. He has, some lapses here, or rather we can point out a few defects in his arguments. For example, as I said earlier, that certain remarks he makes, but he does not elaborate those points. And therefore, for a reader, those remarks or those sentences may seem to be confusing. But overall, Sir Philip Sidney shows a clarity of understanding and a conviction of thought. What I said? A clarity of understanding and a conviction of thought. He was convinced of the things that he was talking. Himself a poet, he himself was a poet, and therefore he could take up cudgels for the poets, for the vocation of poets. And his arguments are very lucidly arranged, and by comparing poets with philosophers and historians, he is in fact emphasizing on the greatness of poetic imagination. It is poetic imagination that makes the poets so great. The historian doesn't have scope to use his imagination because he has to deal with facts. The philosopher is more a teacher than an artist, and therefore imagination in the sense a poet uses doesn't work there in the field of the philosopher. And therefore, by the virtue of imagination, the poet creates. And as I said, that the poet creates poetry which is a source of knowledge and joy. Not only that, one more thing I pointed out, I shall be reminding once again, that he said the poets cannot be made, poets are born poets. Though he doesn't elaborately discuss that point or explain that point, but I try to explain to you that what he means is that, well, a poet, in a poet, the potentials of great poetry or great imagination must be there, ingrained. Perhaps the poetic faculties, the poetic imagination cannot be taught to anybody. So, well, once again, I shall be ending by giving to you another sloka from Sanskrit, where it is said that, well, the beloved and poetry, both of them should come automatically. Kobita bonitaschaiva sukhoda samupagata. Kobita, you know, poetry. Bonita means the beloved. They must come automatically. So, the imagination of the poet, the creative faculty of the poet must come to him or her automatically. Now, well, those things cannot be taught to anybody. Perhaps that is what Sir Philip Sidney tried to convey. Thank you very much.